Ohio Territory, 1792, a time when the frontier was painted in blood and betrayal, where sacred grounds held secrets darker than any prayer, and where vengeance could bind two souls across the divide of race and rage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills like spirits refusing to depart the earth, and 22-year-old Rebecca Hartwell had no idea this would be the last sunrise she'd witness as the person she'd always been. The Caldwell wagon train, 37 souls bound for the promise of Ohio farmland, had been making steady progress through the disputed territory between white settlement and Shawnee hunting grounds. Rebecca, the eldest daughter of a Pennsylvania blacksmith, had insisted on making this journey despite her parents' concerns about her unmarried status and the dangers of frontier life. She'd always been different from other young women her age, too curious about the world beyond parlor walls, too quick with questions that made men uncomfortable, too skilled with her father's tools for a lady of supposed breeding. The wagon train had welcomed her useful hands and sharp mind, even as some whispered about the impropriety of an unwed woman traveling without proper family guidance. Rebecca had learned to ignore such gossip during their 2-month journey, finding purpose in helping with repairs, treating minor ailments with her knowledge of herbs, and proving herself indispensable to the survival of the group. The day had begun like any other, with Rebecca rising before dawn to help prepare the morning meal. She'd always been an early riser, finding solace in those quiet moments before the camp stirred to life. The autumn air carried hints of the coming winter, and she'd wrapped herself in her mother's woolen shawl, one of the few precious items she'd brought from home, as she moved about her tasks with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Crawford, the train's unofficial leader since her husband served as wagon master, had assigned Rebecca to gathering firewood from the stand of oaks that bordered their campsite. It was a task she'd performed dozens of times during their journey, one that allowed her precious moments of solitude in the wilderness that both thrilled and humbled her. Unlike the other women who seemed frightened by every rustling leaf, Rebecca felt drawn to the forest's ancient rhythms and mysterious depths. As she filled her canvas sack with fallen branches and dried kindling, Rebecca let her mind wander to their destination, a plot of land near the Scioto River, where she hoped to establish herself as a healer and midwife. She'd spent years learning from old Mrs. Whitmore back in Pennsylvania, absorbing knowledge of healing herbs and birthing practices that would be invaluable on the frontier. The prospect of independence, of building something entirely her own, filled her with an excitement that made the hardships of trail life bearable. The first gunshot shattered the morning calm like lightning splitting an ancient oak. Rebecca dropped instantly to the ground, her father's lessons about frontier dangers flooding back. Stay low, stay quiet, observe before acting. More shots followed in rapid succession, accompanied by screams that turned her blood to ice water. Through the underbrush, she could see mounted figures charging into the circle of wagons, at least 20 men with painted faces and feathered hair, war cries piercing the air as they fired indiscriminately into the camp. But something felt wrong about the attacker's appearance, even through her terror. Her father had taught her to notice details, to question what seemed obvious. These raiders moved with military precision rather than the fluid tactics she'd heard described of native warfare. Their face paint looked fresh, almost theatrical, and she caught glimpses of European features beneath the pigments and feathers. Mr. Crawford emerged from his wagon with his rifle, shouting orders to the other men, but an arrow took him in the chest before he could fire a shot. Mrs. Crawford's scream cut through the chaos as she ran to her fallen husband, only to be struck down by a raider's hatchet. The violence was systematic, merciless, designed to prevent any coordinated resistance. Rebecca watched in horror as families she'd grown to love over 2 months of shared hardship were cut down without mercy. The Millers, whose young son had shown her a collection of interesting stones just the day before. The Harrisons, who'd celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary only a week ago with a modest cake Mrs. Harrison had managed to bake in a Dutch oven. The Reverend Davies, who'd held evening services and married 2 young couples during the journey. Young Tommy Fletcher, barely 16 and eager to prove himself a man, tried to rally the other young men for a counterattack. Rebecca watched him fall with 3 bullets in his chest, his life bleeding out into the Ohio soil he dreamed of farming. Sarah Wells, the schoolteacher who'd been keeping the children educated during the journey, died shielding her pupils with her own body. A gesture that saved no one, but spoke to the courage that had brought them all west. The attack lasted perhaps 15 minutes, though it felt like hours to Rebecca pressed against the cold earth. When the gunfire finally ceased, an eerie silence settled over the campsite, broken only by the groaning of wounded horses and the crackling of wagons set ablaze. Rebecca remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe, as the raiders moved through the carnage with businesslike efficiency. She watched them strip valuables from the dead, jewelry, coins, weapons, anything portable and valuable. They worked quickly, talking among themselves in hushed tones. When one called out to another, she heard clearly English words, not the Shawnee language she'd expected. The deception ran deeper than simple disguise. These were white men masquerading as Indians for reasons she couldn't fathom. "Make sure we got them all," a voice commanded with authority that suggested military training. "Can't have any witnesses telling tales about what they seen." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. They weren't just robbing the wagon train, they were eliminating evidence of their true identity. This wasn't a random Indian attack, but something far more sinister, a calculated massacre designed to blame the Shawnee for white men's crimes. She pressed herself deeper into the underbrush, praying the shadows would conceal her completely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 raiders approached her hiding spot, close enough that she could smell the bear grease and smoke they'd used to darken their skin. One carried a bloody scalp, Mrs. Harrison's grey hair unmistakable even in death. The casual cruelty of it made Rebecca's stomach churn, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still. "Found anything over there?" the first man called. "Just dead folks and crying horses," the second replied. "Davies had a nice gold watch. That widow woman had some decent jewelry hidden in her corset." They moved on, their voices fading as they continued their grisly inventory. Rebecca counted heartbeats, forcing her breathing to remain shallow and silent. She'd learned patience during long hours in Mrs. Whitmore's herb garden, but this was different. Patience measured not in minutes, but in the spaces between life and death. When the raiders finally mounted up and rode west, whooping and hollering like victorious war parties, Rebecca still didn't move. She'd learned enough about frontier survival to know that returning too soon could mean death if stragglers remained behind. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the massacre in harsh, unforgiving light. Only when the sun reached its zenith did Rebecca finally gather the courage to emerge from her hiding place. The scene that greeted her defied comprehension. Bodies lay scattered throughout the camp like discarded dolls, some still clutching weapons they'd never had chance to use. The wagons smoldered in ruins, their contents either stolen or destroyed. Even the livestock had been butchered, ensuring no one could follow the raiders' trail. She moved through the carnage like a sleepwalker, checking each body in desperate hope of finding survivors. Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught her card games during boring evening halts, dead. The widow Morrison, who'd shared precious tea and stories of her late husband, dead. Even the children, innocent of any crime except existing when evil men needed scapegoats. Rebecca found her own wagon near the center of the destruction. Her father had built it strong, with reinforced wheels and extra storage for her books and medical supplies. The raiders had broken it apart with systematic thoroughness, scattering her possessions like leaves in autumn wind. Her precious collection of medical texts lay trampled and torn. The silver locket containing her mother's portrait had been taken, along with every item of value. But beneath an overturned crate, she discovered something the raiders had missed. A small leather pouch containing her mother's pearl earrings and her grandmother's wedding ring. Simple pieces, not immediately valuable to thieves, but priceless to Rebecca as connections to the life she'd left behind. She clutched them to her chest, the first tears finally breaking through her shock. Reality settled over her like winter, ice. She was alone in hostile territory with no supplies, no weapons, no means of survival. The nearest white settlement lay 60 miles east through territory she didn't know. The raiders had ridden west, which meant following the established trails could bring her face to face with the same men who'd murdered everyone she'd traveled with. Rebecca forced herself to think practically despite the grief threatening to overwhelm her. Water was the most immediate concern. She could survive weeks without food, but only days without water. She'd need shelter, as temperatures would drop sharply once the sun set. A weapon for protection and hunting, fire for warmth, and to purify water, knowledge of the land to avoid getting lost. She salvaged what she could from the destruction: a dented water bucket, a small knife that had fallen beneath a wagon, a wool blanket singed but still usable, a fire steel and tinder from the ruins of the cook wagon. Not much for survival in the wilderness, but better than nothing. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Make do with what you have, Rebecca. Complaining about what you lack won't keep you alive." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Rebecca made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Rather than attempt to reach distant settlements across unknown territory, she would head north toward the hills, where rumor said ancient caves provided shelter. She'd heard stories around the campfire about sacred places in these lands, caves where the native peoples performed ceremonies and left offerings to their spirits. The idea should have frightened her, seeking refuge in places considered sacred by people whose homes the settlers were claiming. But Rebecca had always been curious about native beliefs and practices, unlike many whites who dismissed such things as heathen superstition. If these caves offered genuine shelter, she'd worry about any spiritual implications later. Survival took precedence over religious propriety. She wrapped the salvaged supplies in the blanket, fashioning a crude pack she could carry across her shoulders. With a final look at the ruins of the wagon train, the closest thing to home she'd known for 2 months, Rebecca turned her face toward the northern hills and began to walk. The first day tested her resolve at every step. Unused to traveling cross-country, she stumbled frequently over hidden roots and rocks. Her soft-soled shoes, adequate for camp life, proved woefully inadequate for wilderness hiking. Blisters formed and burst, reformed and burst again, each step becoming a small act of will over pain. But Rebecca pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. She followed a deer path that seemed to lead generally north, reasoning that animals knew where water could be found. The path led through dense forest, punctuated by small clearings where she gathered handfuls of late-season berries and edible roots she recognized from Mrs. Whitmore's teachings. Not much sustenance, but enough to keep her moving. As evening approached, Rebecca searched for a defensible place to spend the night. She needed somewhere protected from both weather and potential predators, both animal and human. A small overhang of rock provided adequate shelter, and she managed to gather enough deadfall for a small fire. The flames offered comfort as much as warmth, pushing back the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by every sound the forest made. Owls calling across valleys, branches creaking in evening wind, the distant howl of wolves that sent ice through her veins. She'd grown up on stories of frontier life, but experiencing it personally proved far more challenging than any tale suggested. Yet with each hour that passed, each small survival success, Rebecca felt something hardening within her, a determination that went beyond mere endurance. Dawn brought new challenges. Her water supply was running low, and she'd seen no streams or springs during the previous day's travel. The north-leading path had faded away during the night, leaving her without clear direction through increasingly rugged terrain. Hills rose more steeply now, covered with dense forest that blocked long-distance vision. She could be walking toward salvation or deeper into danger, with no way to know which. But Rebecca pressed on, driven by instincts she didn't fully understand. Something about the northern hills called to her. Perhaps the promise of higher ground where she could see for miles. Perhaps simple desperation that demanded forward movement rather than hopeless circling. She climbed steadily through the morning, her breath forming small clouds in the cooling air, marking her progress up the mountainside. It was midday when she found the first sign that she wasn't alone in these wild lands. Carved into a tree, beside a small stream, was a symbol she didn't recognize, spiraling lines arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate, meaningful. The carving looked fresh, made within the past few days or weeks. Someone had been here recently, someone familiar with this territory. Rebecca drank deeply from the stream, refilled her bucket, and studied the carving carefully. Her father had taught her to observe details, to read signs that might warn of danger or promise aid. The symbol could mean many things: a territorial marker, a direction sign, a warning to stay away, but it definitely indicated human presence in what she'd assumed was empty wilderness. She continued following the stream upward, reasoning that water sources might lead to the caves she sought. The terrain grew more rugged with each mile, forcing her to scramble over fallen logs and navigate around boulder fields that threatened to turn her ankles with every step. But her body was adapting, finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. The soft-handed blacksmith's daughter was transforming into something harder, more resilient. As afternoon wore on, Rebecca noticed more signs of human presence. Not European, no axe marks on trees, no wheel ruts or horse tracks, but something more subtle. Arrangements of stones that seemed too regular to be natural, bent branches that created arrow-like patterns pointing further up the mountain. Someone had marked this path for others to follow, creating a trail invisible to casual observers, but clear to those who knew how to read the signs. The path led to a narrow defile between two stone walls where ancient water had carved a passage through the mountain rock. As Rebecca squeezed through the gap, she emerged into a hidden valley unlike anything she'd ever seen. Steep walls rose on all sides, creating a natural amphitheater perhaps 200 yards across. At the far end, a dark opening in the cliff face marked what could only be a cave, and not just any cave. Even from a distance, Rebecca could sense something different about this place. The air felt charged, like moments before a thunderstorm. The silence was profound. Not the empty quiet of dead spaces, but the expectant hush of places holding their breath. Around the cave entrance, she could see arranged stones, faded paint on rock faces, the accumulated signs of human presence spanning perhaps centuries. This was not merely shelter, but a sacred place, a site of spiritual significance to the native peoples who had lived in these lands long before white settlement began. Rebecca hesitated at the valley entrance, suddenly aware that she was trespassing on ground held wholly by people her own race was displacing. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking sanctuary in the sacred places of those her society called savages and enemies. But survival overshadowed theological concerns. Darkness was approaching, and this hidden valley offered protection from weather and discovery that she couldn't find elsewhere. Whatever spiritual protocols governed this place, she'd have to hope that desperate need granted her some form of acceptable passage. She approached the cave mouth cautiously, every step feeling like a descent into a world older and stranger than anything her Pennsylvania upbringing had prepared her for. The cave entrance stood perhaps 10 feet high and 15 wide, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow her small fire's light. On either side of the opening, painted symbols covered the rock face, spirals, animals, human figures dancing or performing rituals she couldn't interpret. Some paintings looked ancient, faded to barely visible traces, while others appeared more recent, their colors still vibrant against the stone. Rebecca gathered her courage and entered the sacred space that would become her salvation, her prison, and ultimately, her transformation. Inside, the cave opened into a larger chamber big enough to house several families comfortably. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above, invisible in the darkness beyond her small fire's reach. Along the walls, she could see evidence of long occupation, fire-blackened areas where countless ceremonies had been held, raised sleeping areas built from carefully stacked stones, even carved channels that directed rainwater into natural cisterns. This wasn't merely a cave, but a sanctuary, constructed and maintained over generations for purposes she could only imagine. The very air seemed to hold the echoes of prayers, rituals, and ceremonies performed over centuries. As Rebecca explored the space with her small torch, she felt like an intruder disturbing the dreams of the ancient dead. But the cave offered everything she needed for survival: shelter from weather, defensible position, even fresh water from the natural cisterns that collected rainfall from hidden openings above. She established herself in an alcove near the entrance, where smoke from her fire would dissipate naturally. The stone walls provided perfect insulation, maintaining temperature even as the night air outside grew cold enough to frost. As she settled into her bedroll and stared into the dancing flames, Rebecca reflected on the day's journey. From massacre survivor to trespasser in sacred space, from civilized woman to wilderness refugee, each step had taken her further from the person she'd been that morning, gathering firewood while dreaming of healing practice and independence. Now independence had a different meaning entirely. Not the freedom to choose her path, but the necessity of creating one, step by determined step, in a world that had become unrecognizable overnight. The cave walls seemed to whisper with the voices of all who had sheltered here before her. Sacred ground had become sanctuary, and Rebecca Hartwell, blacksmith's daughter, unmarried woman, massacre survivor, settled into sleep in a place where the boundaries between spiritual and physical, between past and present, grew thin as autumn air. Outside the hidden valley, night fell over the Ohio territory like a blanket smothering stars. But within the sacred cave, Rebecca found the first real rest she'd known since morning brought Massacre to the Caldwell wagon train. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of will and ingenuity. But tonight, surrounded by the spirits of the ancient place, she slept the deep sleep of the utterly exhausted, while winds whispered prophecies through stone passages older than memory. Rebecca Hartwell's first dawn in the sacred cave arrived with the soft patter of rain against stone, a sound that would have terrified her in the open wilderness, but now provided blessed confirmation of the shelter's protection. She had slept deeper than expected, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion despite the alien surroundings. Awakening to the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, she realized with profound relief that she was still alive, a victory that yesterday had seemed impossible. The painted walls surrounding her seemed different in daylight, their colors more vibrant, their meanings perhaps more complex than her torch-lit examination had revealed. As Rebecca stirred the embers of her fire back to life, she noticed details that darkness had hidden. The ceiling bore intricate patterns that seemed to map constellations, while lower walls depicted what appeared to be healing ceremonies. Complete with figures holding plants she now recognized from her studies with Mrs. Whitmore. This wasn't merely a sacred space. It was a repository of knowledge, wisdom accumulated over generations by people her society dismissed as primitive. The irony struck her powerfully as she prepared her meager breakfast of berries and edible roots. Here she sat, a white woman seeking survival in a place created by the very people her race was driving from their ancestral lands. Yet the cave offered her exactly what she needed most: knowledge of healing, survival, and adaptation. The painted walls became her first teachers in a curriculum she'd never imagined having to master. Rebecca spent her second day methodically, exploring the cave system, discovering that the main chamber connected to several smaller rooms through passages worn smooth by countless feet over centuries. One chamber contained what appeared to be a natural pharmacy, shelves carved into rock walls where generations of healers had stored their herbs and medicines. Though the organic materials had long since decomposed, the arrangement suggested sophisticated knowledge of plant properties and medical applications. In another chamber, she found evidence that confirmed her growing understanding of this place's significance. Carved into a natural altar were symbols representing healing, protection, and renewal, concepts that transcended cultural boundaries. This sacred space had been dedicated to preservation of life, making her presence here perhaps less of a violation than she'd initially feared. She wasn't just seeking shelter. She was learning from mentors separated by time and culture, but united. By shared dedication to healing and survival, the cave's water supply proved more abundant than she dared hope. Natural cisterns captured rainfall through carefully engineered channels carved into the rock overhead, creating a renewable source of clean water that would sustain her indefinitely. Whoever had designed this system possessed engineering knowledge, equal to any European architect, another reminder that intelligence and skill weren't monopolized by white civilization. As days passed, Rebecca established routines that transformed mere survival into systematic learning. Each morning she studied different sections of painted walls, copying symbols and images into a journal made from scraped bark and charcoal. The act of documentation served multiple purposes: preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost, keeping her mind active and purposeful, and creating a tangible connection to the wisdom embedded in these stone walls. Her afternoons were spent foraging in the hidden valley, gradually expanding her knowledge of useful plants and their properties. The valley proved to be a natural garden, carefully maintained by generations who understood the delicate balance between taking and giving back. She found medicinal herbs whose properties she recognized, others whose uses she could only guess at, and some that seemed to grow nowhere else, perhaps deliberately cultivated in this protected space. Rebecca's evenings became devoted to practical skills that would keep her alive. She learned to weave baskets from valley grasses, following techniques implied by the painted walls rather than taught by human instructors. She practiced making pottery from clay deposits near the water source, firing her crude attempts in the cave's fire pit. Each success, however small, built her confidence and proved that survival was possible through determination and careful observation. The most challenging aspect of her solitary existence proved to be maintaining mental equilibrium. Without human interaction, Rebecca found herself talking to the painted figures on the walls, sharing her thoughts and fears with representations of healers, warriors, and spiritual leaders from centuries past. Rather than feeling foolish about these one-sided conversations, she began to sense a profound connection, as if the accumulated wisdom of generations was somehow accessible to those who approached it with genuine respect and need. Weeks passed, In this pattern of learning, adaptation, and growth, Rebecca's hands, once soft from indoor work, developed calluses from craft activities and food preparation. Her body grew leaner but stronger, adapting to a diet of wild foods and spring water. More significantly, her mind underwent transformation as she absorbed not just survival skills, but an entirely different way of understanding the natural world. The cave's teachings extended beyond practical knowledge to philosophical insights that challenged everything she'd been raised to believe. The painted walls depicted humans not as masters of nature, but as participants in larger cycles of growth, death, and renewal. This perspective proved particularly valuable as autumn deepened toward winter, teaching her to see seasonal changes not as hardships to endure, but as natural rhythms to embrace and work with rather than against. As her physical situation stabilized, Rebecca began to grapple with questions that survival urgency had temporarily suppressed. What had motivated the massacre of the Caldwell wagon train? Why had white men disguised themselves as Indians to carry out the murders? What purpose did such deception serve, and who benefited from blaming indigenous peoples for crimes committed by Europeans? These questions haunted her quiet moments, demanding answers she couldn't provide alone. The mystery deepened when she discovered evidence that she wasn't the first recent occupant of the sacred cave. Hidden in one of the smaller chambers, she found items that clearly belonged to someone who'd stayed here within the past year. A metal knife of European manufacture, remnants of cloth that had been used as bandages, carved symbols that seemed more contemporary than the ancient paintings surrounding them. Someone else had sought refuge here, someone familiar with both native traditions and European tools. This discovery forced Rebecca to confront an uncomfortable truth. Her sanctuary might not remain secret forever. Whoever had been here before might return, bringing questions about her presence that she wasn't prepared to answer. More troubling was the possibility that the massacre's perpetrators might eventually track her to this place, turning her refuge into a trap. Yet these concerns couldn't overshadow the profound healing taking place within her spirit as well as her body. The massacre had left wounds deeper than physical trauma, a shattered sense of safety, trust in human nature, belief in justice or divine protection. The cave's ancient wisdom offered a different framework for understanding suffering and survival, one that acknowledged pain without being dominated by it. Rebecca began to understand that the indigenous peoples who created this sanctuary had faced their own massacres, betrayals, and losses over the centuries. Yet they had endured, adapted, passed down knowledge and traditions that enabled survival across generations of upheaval. Their resilience wasn't based on denying tragedy, but on finding meaning and purpose that transcended individual suffering. This shift in perspective transformed her daily routines from mere survival activities into spiritual practices. Gathering food became an opportunity to understand the reciprocal relationship between humans and land. Studying the painted walls evolved into meditation on wisdom that connected her across time to other survivors, other healers, other people who had faced seemingly impossible circumstances and found ways forward. The approaching winter presented new challenges that would test everything she'd learned. Food sources grew scarcer as plants completed their cycles and entered dormancy. Temperatures dropped steadily, requiring more fuel for heating and careful attention to conserving body warmth. Snow would soon isolate the valley completely, cutting off any possibility of outside contact until spring returned. But Rebecca faced these challenges with confidence born of preparation and hard-won knowledge. She dried and stored sufficient plant foods to supplement whatever game she might catch through the winter months. Her basket-weaving skills had produced containers for organizing and protecting her supplies. Most importantly, she'd learned to read the cave's microenvironments, understanding which areas stayed warmest and how to manage fire efficiently for maximum heat with minimum fuel consumption. The cave itself seemed to be preparing for winter as well. Natural air currents that had provided cooling during autumn heat now began to shift, creating warming drafts that circulated heated air from the fire pit throughout the living spaces. Rebecca marveled at the engineering sophistication that created these climate control systems without any mechanical components, proof that intelligence and planning had shaped every aspect of this sanctuary. As the first snows began to fall, sealing the valley from outside world, Rebecca experienced an unexpected sense of completion rather than isolation. The sacred cave had become more than shelter. It was a school, a temple, a sanctuary where she was learning to become someone new. The frightened young woman who'd fled the massacre still existed within her, but she was being joined by someone stronger, a healer, a survivor, a bridge between worlds she was only beginning to understand. Her journal entries from this period reflect the transformation occurring within her. Early entries focused on immediate survival concerns, finding food, staying warm, avoiding detection. Later entries revealed deeper contemplation of the cave's teachings, attempts to understand the spiritual practices depicted on the walls, growing appreciation for the sophisticated knowledge systems of indigenous peoples. "I came here seeking a shelter," she wrote by firelight as snow accumulated outside the cave mouth, "but I am finding education of a kind no university could provide. These walls speak of truths my people never taught me, that wisdom exists in many forms, that survival requires community even across centuries, that the sacred and practical are not separate realms, but unified aspects of existence." Rebecca's growing understanding of the cave's significance extended beyond academic interest to personal transformation. She began to see herself not as a temporary refugee awaiting rescue, but as a custodian of ancient knowledge, responsible for preserving, and perhaps eventually sharing what she was learning. This shift in perspective gave new meaning to her solitude and new purpose to her survival. The meditation practices implied by wall paintings became part of her daily routine, providing mental discipline that complemented physical preparation for winter. She learned to enter states of deep contemplation where solutions to practical problems seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond conscious thought. Whether this was spiritual revelation or simply her mind accessing knowledge absorbed through careful observation, the results proved valuable for navigation through the cave complex, identification of useful plants, and understanding the subtle signs that predicted weather changes. Winter deepened, transforming the hidden valley into a crystalline world of ice and snow. The cave entrance remained partially open, allowing fresh air circulation, while snow drifts provided additional insulation. Inside, Rebecca maintained her routines of study, craft work, and meditation, finding peace in the rhythm of activities that connected her to cycles larger than individual existence. She developed new skills born of necessity and inspiration from the cave paintings, learning to tan hide from animals that had died natural deaths, creating tools from stone using techniques suggested by archaeological evidence scattered throughout the chambers, even attempting to recreate some of the pigments used in the wall paintings. Each success deepened her connection to the place and its history. The isolation that might have driven another person to madness became, for Rebecca, a period of unprecedented growth and self-discovery. Without the distractions and expectations of civilized society, she was free to explore aspects of herself that conventional life had never encouraged. Her natural curiosity about healing expanded into fascination with the spiritual dimensions of medicine. Her mechanical aptitude, inherited from her blacksmith father, found new expression in understanding the cave's ingenious engineering. Most importantly, she developed a profound respect for the indigenous knowledge that had created this sanctuary. The people who had built and maintained this place weren't the savages described in frontier newspapers, but sophisticated survivors who had developed sustainable relationships with their environment across countless generations. Their primitive lifestyle revealed itself as conscious choice rather than incapacity, a way of living that took only what was needed and gave back more than it took. This understanding challenged everything Rebecca had been taught about progress, civilization, and the rightness of European expansion into native lands. Sitting in a stone chamber, warmed by fire techniques perfected over centuries, drinking water purified by systems designed before her ancestors had crossed the Atlantic, she began to question fundamental assumptions about which peoples were truly civilized and which were truly savage. As winter solstice approached, marking the deepest point of the year's darkness, Rebecca experienced a profound spiritual event that would define the rest of her time in the sacred cave. During one of her evening meditations, she became aware of a presence in the chamber with her, not threatening, but definitely present. The sensation was so strong that she opened her eyes, expecting to find someone had entered the cave. Instead, she saw the painted walls seeming to pulse with gentle light, the figures appearing to move in her peripheral vision. Rather than fear, she felt overwhelming peace, as if she were being welcomed not just into physical sanctuary, but into spiritual communion with all who had sheltered here before her. The experience lasted only moments, but left her with profound certainty that she was not alone in this place, that the accumulated wisdom and protective spirit of generations surrounded her. From that night forward, Rebecca's relationship with the cave transformed from grateful refuge to active partnership. She began to understand her role not as passive recipient of shelter, but as active participant in the cave's continuing purpose. Her studies of the wall paintings took on new urgency as she realized she was learning not just for her own survival, but for the preservation of knowledge that might otherwise be lost. She documented everything, not just the obvious paintings, but subtle marks and arrangements that revealed deeper meanings, hidden symbols that appeared only in certain light conditions, stone arrangements that aligned with celestial events, visible through openings in the cave ceiling, acoustic properties that created specific sound effects during ceremonies. The cave revealed itself as a masterpiece of integration between natural features and human enhancement, designed to serve multiple functions across generations. Rebecca's journal from this period reveals someone undergoing profound transformation. I am no longer the same person who fled in terror from the Wagon train massacre. That woman was shaped by one culture's understanding of the world. The woman I am becoming has been shaped by an older, deeper wisdom that sees connections where my previous education saw only differences. I do not yet know what I am becoming, but I know I am becoming someone who can bridge these different ways of knowing. As winter continued its grip on the hidden valley, Rebecca prepared not just for spring's return, but for the possibility that her solitude might end. She had evidence that others knew of this place, and eventually someone would come, whether friend or foe remained to be seen. Her growing understanding of the cave's significance convinced her that when that time came, she would be ready not just to survive the encounter, but to advocate for the sacred nature of this place and the wisdom it contained. The sacred cave had become more than sanctuary. It had become a classroom, a temple, and ultimately a crucible in which Rebecca Hartwell was being transformed from a civilized woman fleeing tragedy into something new, a guardian of ancient wisdom, a bridge between cultures, a healer prepared to face whatever challenges the world beyond these stone walls might present. Spring still lay months ahead, but Rebecca faced the remainder of winter with confidence born of knowledge, purpose derived from understanding, and strength drawn from connection to something larger than herself. The frightened refugee who had stumbled into this sacred space was evolving into someone capable of defending not just her own life, but the profound truths that these ancient walls had taught her, truths that might prove essential for survival. In a world where two cultures were converging with often tragic results, the late winter morning that changed everything arrived with deceptive tranquility. Rebecca had been living in the sacred cave for nearly 4 months, her body and spirit so thoroughly adapted to the rhythm of this hidden sanctuary that she could sense weather changes through subtle shifts in air pressure, could identify approaching storms, by the way. Smoke moved through the cave system, could read the cave's moods like pages in a familiar book. She was grinding dried roots into flour, a skill learned through careful observation of the techniques depicted in the wall paintings, when an unfamiliar sound penetrated the valley's usual silence. Not the natural sounds she'd grown accustomed to: wind through stone passages, water dripping from winter ice, the occasional call of hardy winter birds, but something distinctly human. Footsteps, deliberate, careful, but definitely footsteps moving through the snow-covered valley outside. Rebecca's first instinct was to extinguish her fire and retreat to the cave's deeper chambers, following protocols she'd developed for this very scenario. But something about the approaching footsteps gave her pause. They moved too carefully, too respectfully for someone planning violence. The pace suggested someone familiar with sacred ground, someone who understood the significance of this place and approached it with appropriate reverence. Heart hammering against her ribs, Rebecca made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the terrified young woman who'd fled the Wagon massacre months earlier. Instead of hiding, she positioned herself near the cave entrance where she could observe without being immediately seen, trusting in knowledge gained through months of studying this place to keep her safe. The figure that emerged from the trees moved like winter itself, silent, patient, seemingly part of the landscape, rather than an intrusion upon it. Tall and lean, wearing buckskins that had been carefully waterproofed against winter weather, with long black hair braided with feathers and small bones that served both ornamental and practical purposes. But what struck Rebecca most powerfully was the way he moved, with the careful precision of someone equally at home in wilderness and settlement, someone who understood multiple worlds. As he drew closer, she could see that his features reflected mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and copper skin of indigenous peoples combined with European facial structure that spoke of complex ancestry. A half-breed white society would call him dismissively, belonging fully to neither world, but his bearing suggested someone who had found strength in that very duality rather than weakness. He approached the cave entrance with obvious familiarity, pausing to examine signs Rebecca hadn't noticed, scuff marks in stone, the way her fire smoke had stained certain areas, subtle disturbances that told him someone had been living here recently. His examination was thorough but not alarmed, as if he'd expected to find evidence of habitation. When their eyes finally met across the cave mouth, Rebecca felt a strange sense of recognition, though she was certain they'd never encountered each other before. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her, not with the predatory assessment she'd learned to fear from dangerous men, nor with the dismissive evaluation white society typically applied to women alone, but with careful appraisal of someone he recognized as a fellow survivor. "I mean you no harm," he said in English, that carried only the slightest accent, his voice pitched low to avoid echoing through the stone chambers. "My name is Nathan Birdsong. I've been tracking the men who attacked your wagon train." The simple statement hit Rebecca like a physical blow, not because it threatened her, but because it provided the first confirmation that someone else knew what had really happened. Someone else was seeking justice for the massacre that had stolen so many innocent lives. After months of solitary, Grief and growing certainty that the truth would die with her, here stood someone who validated her experience. "How did you know?" she asked, stepping closer to the entrance, but maintaining enough distance to retreat if necessary. "How did you know I was here?" Nathan gestured toward the cave entrance with subtle respect for the sacred nature of the space. "Your tracks led here 5 days ago. I've been watching, learning your patterns, making sure you weren't part of some trap." His dark eyes held depths she couldn't read. "I found you because I've been hunting the men who destroyed your wagon train for longer than you've been hiding in this cave." The revelation that someone had been deliberately seeking justice for her slaughtered companions brought tears Rebecca hadn't allowed herself to shed in months. But Nathan's next words transformed grief into burning anger, then crystallizing purpose. "My name is Nathan Birdsong," he continued, settling into a position that suggested he intended to stay and talk. "My father was James Birdsong, a Shawnee, a war chief. My mother was Elizabeth Morgan, daughter of a Pennsylvania merchant. 20 years ago, they were murdered along with our entire community by the same group of men who killed your wagon train. Men who dress as Indians to commit their crimes, then disappear into white settlements where no one thinks to look for them." Rebecca's mind raced to process this information. The massacre she'd witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern spanning decades. The men who destroyed her life had been doing the same to others for 20 years or more, using racial hatred and misunderstanding to cover their tracks. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How many people have they killed?" Nathan's expression darkened. "Too many to count precisely. Entire families, hunting parties, isolated settlements. Always made to look like the violence came from the other side. Indians attacking whites, whites retaliating against Indians. They profit from the chaos they create, selling information about Indian movements to the army, then selling weapons to both sides, preparing for conflicts they've engineered." The scope of the conspiracy took Rebecca's breath away. What she'd witnessed wasn't random violence, but systematic exploitation of racial tensions for profit. The men who'd murdered her fellow travelers weren't just thieves, but architects of a cruel strategy that turned two peoples against each other while enriching those who remained safely in the shadows. "Why haven't you caught them?" she demanded, feeling anger replace her initial caution. 20 years, someone must know who they are, where they operate from. Nathan's smile held no warmth. "Catching them isn't the problem. Proving their crimes in courts that assume Indians lie and whites tell truth. That's the challenge. I've tracked them, fought them, even captured some. But without evidence that satisfies white law, they're always released to continue their work." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity increasing. "That's why finding you alive is more than I dared hope for. You saw them remove their disguises. You can testify to their true identities in court. You're the witness who could finally bring justice for all their victims." Rebecca felt the weight of expectations settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. After months of learning to think of herself as someone valuable in her own right, healer, student of ancient wisdom, guardian of sacred knowledge, she was being reminded that her primary value to the outside world lay in what she'd witnessed during those terrible 15 minutes of violence. "Who leads them?" she asked, focusing on practical details to avoid being overwhelmed by the larger implications. "I saw the man who commanded the others. Tall, with a scar across his left cheek, voice that suggested military training." Nathan nodded grimly. "Marcus Whitfield, former Army captain, dishonorably discharged for selling weapons to Confederate forces during the war. He's been building this network ever since, recruiting deserters, outlaws, men with grudges against both Indians and the federal government. Smart enough to stay in shadows, but ruthless enough to eliminate anyone who threatens his operation. The name gave Rebecca's nightmares a human face, transforming abstract evil into specific enemy, Marcus Whitfield. She filed the name away carefully, adding it to the mental catalogue of evidence she'd been building from her memories of the massacre. "Where is he now?" she asked. "That's what I've been trying to discover. His group moves seasonally, like the people they imitate, winter camps in abandoned mining settlements or forgotten homesteads. Spring brings raids timed to coincide with tribal movements and military patrols. He's built a network that spans 3 territories, with sympathizers in territorial governments who ensure his activities are overlooked or misreported." Nathan studied her carefully before continuing. "I was tracking them toward their winter camp when I found signs of the Wagon train massacre. Following your trail brought me here, to this sacred place." He gestured respectfully toward the painted walls, visible inside the cave. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this cave, about the healing ceremonies held here, the knowledge preserved in these stone chambers. She said it was a place where the spirits of the ancient ones still offered guidance to those who came, seeking wisdom." His acknowledgement of the cave's sacred nature touched something deep in Rebecca's spirit. For months, she'd wondered if her presence here was spiritual trespass or ordained sanctuary. Nathan's words suggested the latter, that perhaps she'd been guided here not just for physical survival, but for preparation to become something larger than herself. "The paintings," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "They're not just decoration or record-keeping, they're instruction, teaching survival skills, healing techniques, even strategies for dealing with enemies." She looked at Nathan with growing excitement. "This isn't just a hiding place, it's a school. The people who created this knew that others would come who needed to learn what they'd learned about survival between worlds." Nathan's expression shifted to something approaching awe. "You've been studying the walls seriously? Learning from them?" When Rebecca nodded, he moved closer to the cave entrance, his respect for the space evident in every gesture. "My grandmother would say the spirits chose you, brought you here not just to save your life, but to prepare you for larger purpose." They spent the next several hours sharing knowledge that transformed both their understanding of their situation. Rebecca described everything she'd learned from the cave paintings about healing, survival, and the sophisticated knowledge systems of the indigenous peoples who'd created this sanctuary. Nathan shared his 20-year quest for justice, the network of allies he'd built among both native and white communities, and the evidence he'd gathered about Whitfield's criminal organization. Together, they began to see possibilities that neither had imagined alone. Rebecca's testimony about the massacre, combined with Nathan's accumulated evidence and his knowledge of Whitfield's methods, could build a case strong enough to destroy the entire organization, but it would require more than simply presenting evidence to territorial authorities, many of whom were complicit in or benefiting from Whitfield's activities. "We need federal intervention," Nathan concluded after reviewing everything they knew. "Someone with authority independent of territorial politics. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated by Whitfield's network." "How do we reach such a person?" Rebecca asked. "And more importantly, how do we survive long enough to present our case? Whitfield's people will be hunting for me come spring. They know at least one person survived the massacre. The missing body will have told them that much." Nathan's expression grew thoughtful. "There's a federal judge named William Crawford who's been investigating territorial corruption from his circuit court in Cincinnati. He has reputation for honesty and courage in pursuing cases others avoid. If we could reach him." "But Cincinnati is hundreds of miles from here, through territory controlled by Whitfield's allies," Rebecca pointed out. "2 people traveling together, one obviously Indian, one a woman claiming to have witnessed things certain people want forgotten. We'd be dead before we made it halfway." "Not necessarily," Nathan replied, his plan beginning to take shape. Whitfield's strength is also his weakness. He depends on people seeing what they expect to see. Indians when they're disguised, peaceful settlers when they're in town, military when they want to intimidate. He's trained his people to maintain convincing identities, but he's also created a system where questioning appearances is discouraged. Rebecca began to understand his thinking. You're suggesting we use disguise ourselves? Become people Whitfields? Network wouldn't suspect? More than that. I'm suggesting we become people who could move freely through their territory. People who could gather more evidence while making our way toward federal authorities who could act on what we've learned. The audacity of the plan both thrilled and terrified Rebecca. After months of hiding, the idea of actively infiltrating the network of people who'd murdered her friends seemed like madness. Yet it also offered the first real possibility of justice for all Whitfield's victims, a chance to transform her survival into something meaningful for others. Nathan outlined the details of what he was proposing. They would emerge from the cave in spring as a traveling preacher and his wife, heading east to establish a mission among frontier settlements. The role would explain their movement, their questions about local activities, even their mixed heritage. Nathan could pass for a Methodist minister of mixed race, while Rebecca's educated speech and medical knowledge would support the role of mission wife dedicated to healing ministry. The beauty of it, Nathan explained, is that Whitfield's people are used to dismissing religious folk as harmless idealists. A mixed-race preacher and his wife trying to bring salvation to the wilderness. They'd be invisible to men, focused on political and economic threats. Rebecca found herself caught between admiration for the plan's cleverness and concern about its dangers. What about your quest for vengeance? I thought you were hunting these men for personal reasons. Nathan's expression grew complex, shadows crossing his features like clouds over winter landscape. 20 years ago, I wanted simple revenge, blood for blood, death for death. But I've learned that killing individual members of this network doesn't stop it. Others rise to take their places, and the system continues. Justice requires destroying the entire organization, exposing the corruption that protects it, making such activities impossible rather than merely punishing specific actors. His words resonated with Rebecca's own evolution during months in the sacred cave. She'd entered seeking only survival, but the ancient wisdom embedded in the painted walls had taught her to think beyond individual need to larger purposes. Personal healing had grown into understanding of how individual trauma connected to broader patterns of violence and exploitation. "When would we leave?" she asked, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice that she was committed to this dangerous path. Early spring, when trail travel becomes practical again. That gives us several weeks to prepare, to develop our false identities completely, to practice being people we're not until the deception becomes natural. Nathan paused, studying her carefully. "Are you certain you want to do this? Once we leave this cave, there's no safety to return to. We'll be committed to seeing this through to whatever end awaits." Rebecca looked around the sacred cave that had been her home, her school, her sanctuary for 4 months. The painted walls that had taught her about survival, healing, and wisdom older than European settlement. The stone chambers that had protected her not just from winter weather but from despair and madness that might have claimed someone less willing to learn from ancient teachers. Leaving this place would be the hardest thing she'd done since fleeing the Wagon Massacre, but staying here forever would make her survival meaningless, a purely selfish victory over tragedy rather than transformation that could help others. The cave had prepared her for this choice, had shaped her into someone capable of venturing beyond personal safety for larger purposes. "I'm certain," she said firmly. "These people killed my friends, destroyed families, turned entire communities against each other for profit. If hiding here preserved my life and taught me skills needed to stop them, then everything I've experienced, including finding this sacred place, was preparation for what comes next." Nathan smiled for the first time since his arrival, an expression that transformed his stern features and revealed the man behind the hunter. "My grandmother always said the cave chose its students carefully. Those who learn its lessons become teachers themselves, carrying ancient wisdom into new battles." Over the following days, Nathan shared more about himself and his long pursuit of justice. Born to parents whose love had bridged two cultures, he'd grown up understanding both Shawnee traditions and European customs, speaking multiple languages, comfortable in wilderness or settlement. The massacre of his community when he was Rebecca's current age had set him on this path of hunting those responsible, but years of experience had refined his understanding of justice and its requirements. He taught Rebecca skills that complemented what she'd learned from the cave paintings: how to move through different social environments without attracting attention, how to ask questions that seemed innocent but gathered crucial information, how to recognize signs that indicated danger, whether from animals, weather, or hostile humans. Most importantly, how to maintain true identity while wearing false appearance, staying connected to essential self while appearing to be someone else entirely. Rebecca, in turn, shared knowledge she'd gained from months of studying the cave's accumulated wisdom, medical techniques the ancient inhabitants had developed, understanding of plant properties and their applications, even spiritual practices that provided mental discipline under stress. Nathan was particularly interested in her documentation of the cave's contents, recognizing that she'd created an invaluable record of indigenous knowledge that might otherwise be lost. As winter gradually released its grip on the hidden valley, Rebecca and Nathan prepared meticulously for their journey. They created false backgrounds complete with personal histories, practiced their roles until deception became natural, gathered supplies appropriate to traveling missionaries rather than fugitive witnesses. Most challenging was developing the emotional intimacy required to portray a married couple convincingly, learning to interact with the casual intimacy of spouses while maintaining respect for their actual relationship as allies with complementary missions. The final weeks in the cave were bittersweet. Rebecca had come to love this place that had saved her life and transformed her understanding of survival, wisdom, and cultural connection. Leaving meant abandoning the security and beauty she'd found here for uncertain dangers and challenges ahead. Yet she felt confident that the cave had given her everything she needed for the next phase of her journey, not just practical skills, but spiritual strength, not just knowledge, but wisdom to use it well. Nathan proved similarly affected by their shared time in this sacred space. Though he'd known of the cave through family stories, experiencing its patient instruction and accumulated wisdom firsthand deepened his connection to both his heritage and his mission. The ancient teachers represented in these painted walls had shaped not just Rebecca, but him as well, preparing both for challenges that would require every lesson they'd absorbed. On the morning of their departure, Rebecca performed a ceremony she'd observed in the cave paintings, but adapted for her own circumstances. She lit a fire in the central chamber, offered prayers of gratitude for the sanctuary provided, and left small tokens as acknowledgement of what she'd received: dried herbs from her foraging, small carved items she'd made during winter months, even pages from her journal documenting what she'd learned. Nathan added his own offerings, speaking words in Shawnee that seemed to resonate through the stone chambers. The cave itself seemed to acknowledge their departure, air currents shifting in ways that sent the smoke from their final fire spiraling upward through natural chimneys, carrying their gratitude skyward. As they emerged from the hidden valley, for the first time in months, Rebecca looked back once at the cave entrance, almost invisible among winter bare trees and snow-covered stone. She carried with her not just physical items necessary for their mission, but intangible gifts that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Confidence earned through survival, wisdom learned from ancient teachers, purpose larger than personal safety or simple revenge. The scared young woman who'd fled the Wagon massacre had been transformed in this sacred place into someone ready to face the architects of that massacre, equipped not just with evidence and determination, but with understanding that connected her individual suffering to broader patterns of injustice that demanded confrontation. Nathan walked beside her as they began their journey toward uncertain future, but Rebecca felt accompanied as well by the spirits of all who had sheltered in the cave before them, all who had learned from its walls, all who had emerged, strengthened, for battles that preserved knowledge, protected innocence, and challenged those who profited from division and hatred. Spring was coming to the Ohio Territory, bringing with it their first real opportunity since the massacre to seek justice for the dead and protection for the living. Rebecca Hartwell and Nathan Birdsong, carrying between them centuries of accumulated wisdom and months of careful preparation, set out to confront Marcus Whitfield and his network of killers, disguised as emissaries of peace, but armed with truth that could destroy an empire built on lies. The spring sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills as Rebecca and Nathan made their way toward Marietta, the first settlement on their carefully planned route to Cincinnati. They had been traveling for 3 weeks, their false identities, as Reverend Nathan and Mrs. Sarah Goodwin, tested repeatedly as they moved through frontier communities where strangers were subject to intense scrutiny. Their transformation had been remarkable. Nathan's natural charisma served him well in the role of itinerant preacher, his mixed heritage lending authenticity to his message of unity and understanding between all peoples. Rebecca had discovered an unexpected talent for the role of mission wife, her medical knowledge from the cave paintings proving invaluable in treating ailments wherever they stopped, establishing their reputation as genuine servants of both God and community. But it was in Marietta that their mission truly began, in earnest. The thriving river town served as a hub for information flowing between military posts, trading settlements, and territorial authorities. If Whitfield's network operated as Nathan suspected, they would find evidence of its influence here in the heart of Ohio's commercial activity. They established themselves in the town's modest inn, spending their first evening listening carefully to conversations in the common room. Rebecca, playing the devoted wife, helping her husband with his notes for Sunday's sermon, kept her ears open while appearing absorbed in feminine pursuits of mending and correspondence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Eleanor Hartman, who took kindly to the young mission couple and shared her concerns about recent troubling events in the territory. "It's such relief to have genuine religious folk staying with us," she confided to Rebecca while serving. "Then breakfast the second morning. We've had too many false preachers passing through lately, men who talk salvation but leave behind nothing but trouble and empty coin purses." Rebecca exchanged a subtle glance with Nathan. "False preachers. How terrible. Have you reported this to the authorities?" Mrs. Hartman's expression grew troubled. "That's the peculiar thing. When we complained to the territorial marshal about one group, he seemed already familiar with them. Said they were special agents conducting sensitive investigations on behalf of territorial security. But what kind of investigation requires stealing from honest folk and spreading lies about Indian raids that never happened?" Nathan leaned forward with genuine pastoral concern. "Lies about Indian raids? I'm afraid I don't understand." "Oh, it's been going on for months," Mrs. Hartman continued, clearly relieved to share her concerns with sympathetic listeners. "These Men arrive claiming to be ministers or military couriers or government surveyors. They spread rumors about impending Indian attacks, convince people to buy extra weapons or pay for protection, then disappear when their predictions prove false. Meanwhile, real Indian attacks get blamed on peaceful tribes who weren't anywhere near the area. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. This matched exactly the pattern Nathan had described, creating chaos and fear to profit from all sides while ensuring Indians and whites remained enemies rather than questioning who truly benefited from their conflict. "Have you noticed any patterns in these false preachers' behavior?" Nathan asked carefully. "Perhaps details that might help identify them if they've targeted other communities?" Mrs. Hartman considered thoughtfully. "Well, they often ask very specific questions about military movements, patrol schedules, which settlements have valuable goods or few men for defense. And they always seem particularly interested in stories about recent attacks. Who survived, what was taken, whether anyone might have witnessed details about the attackers." The last comment sent ice through Rebecca's veins. Whitfield's network wasn't just creating false raids, they were systematically hunting for witnesses to real ones, trying to ensure no one could contradict their carefully constructed narratives. That afternoon, Nathan announced his intention to visit the local military post to offer his services as chaplain, a cover that would allow him to investigate military records and personnel. Rebecca, meanwhile, would visit the town's small medical clinic to share knowledge about herbal treatments, establishing their credibility while gathering information from another angle. The military post proved richly informative. Nathan discovered records showing unusual patterns in patrol deployments, with certain areas consistently under-patrolled during times when Indian raids were reported. More telling were requisition records showing large purchases of weapons and supplies by special territorial agents whose names appeared nowhere in official military rosters. Rebecca's visit to the medical clinic revealed equally disturbing information. Dr. James Morrison, the frontier physician who ran the clinic, proved eager to discuss cases with someone who shared his dedication to healing. "I've seen too many unusual wounds lately," he confided, as they examined his supply of medicinal herbs together. "Injuries claimed to be from Indian weapons, but inflicted by European blades, burns that suggest close-range gunpowder rather than fire arrows. Even some patients who insisted their attackers spoke perfect English, before realizing they'd revealed too much." "Perfect English?" Rebecca asked, maintaining her cover of innocent curiosity while her mind raced. One man brought in with a severe head wound kept insisting his attackers had discussed something about maintaining the schedule and reporting back to the captain. Poor fellow was delirious, of course. According to the official report, he'd been attacked by Shawnee warriors during a hunting trip. But Shawnee war parties don't typically concern themselves with schedules or military ranks. Dr. Morrison lowered his voice conspirationally. "Between you and me, Mrs. Goodwin, I've begun to suspect that not all these Indian attacks are what they seem. But who would believe such a suggestion? And more importantly, who would benefit from perpetrating such elaborate deceptions?" Rebecca spent the evening in their room at the inn, documenting everything they'd learned, while Nathan compiled his own intelligence from the military post. The picture emerging was even worse than they'd anticipated. Whitfield's network had infiltrated territorial administration so thoroughly that official reports bore little resemblance to actual events. False raids were being used to justify military actions against peaceful tribes, while real raids by Whitfield's men went uninvestigated. "We need more than testimony and suspicious coincidences," Nathan concluded after reviewing their findings. "Federal authorities will require concrete evidence, documents that prove coordination between Whitfield's people and territorial officials, physical proof of the false flag operations." "Where would we find such evidence?" Rebecca asked. though she suspected she already knew the answer. Nathan's expression grew grim. Whitfield's winter camp. According to what we've learned here, it's located in an abandoned mining settlement about 40 miles north of here. If we could infiltrate it, find their operational records, maybe even witness one of their planning sessions. The audacity of what he was suggesting took Rebecca's breath away. After months of hiding and weeks of careful deception, he was proposing they deliberately place themselves in the heart of Whitfield's operation, surrounded by the very men who'd massacred her wagon train. Yet as she considered the proposal, Rebecca found herself thinking not of the dangers, but of the possibilities. The cave had taught her more than survival skills. It had shown her the power of patience, careful observation, and strategic thinking. If they could gather irrefutable evidence of Whitfield's conspiracy, they could save countless lives that would otherwise be lost to manufactured conflict. "What about our mission to reach Judge Crawford in Cincinnati?" she asked. "Delayed, not abandoned," Nathan replied. "We'll need evidence to support our testimony when we reach him. Right now we have compelling stories, but little proof that couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding or bias. Documents from Whitfield's own operation would change that completely." Indeed, over the next 3 days, they refined their plan with meticulous care. Rather than abandon their clerical disguises, they would adapt them for infiltrating the mining camp. Nathan would approach as a circuit preacher seeking to minister to isolated settlements, while Rebecca would serve as his assistant and translator, roles that would explain their presence and allow them to observe activities while appearing harmless. The key to success lay in their ability to be useful enough to be welcomed, but not so memorable as to attract close scrutiny. Nathan's genuine knowledge of scripture and theology made his preacher role convincing, while Rebecca's medical skills would likely be welcomed in any frontier settlement facing winter's ailments. They acquired additional supplies in Marietta, including a small collection of genuine religious texts and medical supplies that would support their cover identities. More importantly, they gathered intelligence about the abandoned mining settlement, learning its layout and the best routes for approach and potential escape. The journey north took them through increasingly wild territory, past scattered homesteads, and through forests that showed signs of recent violence. Twice they encountered burned cabins with graves marked by crude crosses, testament to the ongoing cycle of attack and retaliation that Whitfield's network deliberately perpetuated. As they traveled, Rebecca found herself thinking often of the sacred cave and the lessons it had taught her. The ancient wisdom embedded in those painted walls had prepared her not just for survival, but for this moment, when knowledge became power, when courage demanded action despite danger, when individual healing transformed into community service. The mining settlement appeared ahead of them on a grey April afternoon, its collection of weathered buildings nestled in a valley scarred by abandoned excavations. Smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating the camp was indeed occupied, though the number of horses corralled near the main building suggested a larger group than they'd expected. "At least 30 men," Nathan observed quietly, as they studied the settlement from a concealed position among the trees. More than just Whitfield's core group. He must be hosting a gathering of some kind. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the implications. A planning meeting, coordinating spring operations. "Exactly what we need to witness," Nathan confirmed. "If we can observe their planning and document their strategies, we'll have evidence that no court could dismiss." They waited until evening before approaching the camp, timing their arrival to suggest they'd been traveling all day rather than observing from nearby. Nathan led the way, projecting the confident humility of a man dedicated to spiritual service, while Rebecca followed slightly behind, playing the role of devoted assistant, helping with their modest supplies. The man who emerged from the main building to greet them matched Nathan's description of Marcus Whitfield perfectly. Tall, scarred, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but the polished manner of someone who moved easily between wilderness and civilization. His smile seemed genuine as he welcomed the traveling preachers, though Rebecca noticed his eyes remained calculating, assessing potential threat or opportunity. "Reverend Goodwin, is it?" Whitfield said, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Marcus Whitfield, supervisor of territorial security operations in this region. What brings you to our remote settlement?" Nathan clasped Whitfield's hand with apparent warmth, showing no sign that he recognized the name of the man he'd hunted for 20 years. "We're traveling circuit, bringing word of God to settlements too isolated for regular ministry. I'm told your people might welcome spiritual guidance during these troubled times." "Indeed they might," Whitfield replied, gesturing for them to enter the main building. "We've recently hosted several meetings about territorial security, and morale could use improvement. Come, share our meal and tell us about your ministry." The interior of the building had been converted into a combination meeting hall and dining area, with perhaps 24 men gathered around rough tables. Rebecca immediately recognized several faces from the Wagon train massacre, though she maintained her pose of shy mission wife, eyes downcast, speaking only when addressed directly. Over dinner, Nathan masterfully played his role, drawing out information while appearing to share his own plans freely. He spoke of settlements they'd visited, trails they'd traveled, their hopes to establish permanent missions among frontier communities. All the while, he and Rebecca listened carefully to conversations around them, gathering intelligence about planned operations. The breakthrough came when Whitfield announced that evening's main business, reviewing spring operational plans with his assembled lieutenants. Rather than dismiss the visiting preachers, he invited them to observe, apparently seeing opportunity in having religious sanction for his activities. "You might find this instructive, Reverend," Whitfield said, as men gathered around a large table covered with maps and documents. "We're discussing how to protect Christian settlements from savage attacks, work that surely aligns with your spiritual mission." What Rebecca witnessed over the next 2 hours exceeded her worst expectations. Whitfield's organization operated with military precision, their protection services extending across 3 territories through a network of corrupt officials, intimidated communities, and carefully manufactured conflicts. The maps showed planned attacks on both white settlements and Indian camps, timed to create maximum disruption while ensuring each side blamed the other. Supply lists detailed weapons that would be sold to both sides, information that would be traded to highest bidders, and officials who would receive portions of profits in exchange for misdirecting military responses. Most damning were the personnel records. Detailed files on Whitfield's operatives, many of whom were deserters from various armies, discharged soldiers seeking profit through violence, and local men recruited through promises of easy money and sanctioned revenge against Indians who had wronged them. Rebecca memorized everything she could while maintaining her pose of innocent observer, occasionally helping her husband with his notes about potential congregation. When Whitfield described plans for a major operation designed to trigger open warfare between Shawnee tribes and white settlements, she had to grip her hands together to avoid showing her rage. "The beauty of it," Whitfield explained to his assembled men, "is that once open warfare begins, both sides will beg for our protection. We'll control the weapons, the information, even the treaties that eventually end the conflict. By winter, we'll have more territory under our influence than some states back east." Nathan asked careful questions that seemed motivated by pastoral concern for the innocent, but actually gathered crucial details about timing, methods, and personnel involved. His performance was masterful. He expressed appropriate religious horror at the violence while praising Whitfield's dedication to protecting Christian civilization from savage depredations. As the meeting concluded, Whitfield seemed genuinely pleased with their audience. "You're welcome to stay the night, Reverend. We don't often have visitors who understand the spiritual dimensions of our work." They were assigned sleeping space in a small cabin near the settlement's edge, ostensibly for privacy and quiet, but actually positioned where they could be easily watched. As soon as they were alone, Rebecca began documenting everything they'd witnessed, writing in code they'd developed during their journey. "We have enough," Nathan whispered as she worked. "More than enough to convict not just Whitfield, but the entire network. Officials in 3 territorial governments, military officers taking bribes, specific plans for manufactured conflicts, everything Judge Crawford would need to bring federal intervention." But their triumph was interrupted by sounds outside. Their cabin, boots on gravel, quiet voices conferring. Through a crack in the wooden wall, they could see men positioning themselves around their quarters. Not guards for protection, but watchers, ensuring they couldn't escape. "He's suspicious," Rebecca realized with growing alarm. "Something we said, some detail that didn't match." Nathan was already moving, gathering their essential supplies while remaining silent. "The questions I asked about military patrols," he whispered grimly, "too specific for a simple preacher. Whitfield's no fool. He's realized we're not what we claim to be." Through their small window they could see Whitfield himself approaching with several armed men. Whatever had aroused his suspicions, their deception was about to be exposed. Rebecca felt panic rising but forced it down, drawing on lessons learned in the sacred cave about maintaining clarity under pressure. "The documents," she whispered urgently. "We can't let him find what we've written." Nathan was already concealing their coded notes in the lining of Rebecca's medical bag, the one place their captors might not immediately search. "If they take us alive, they'll want to know what we learned, who sent us. That might give us time to escape or get word to others." The cabin door opened without warning, Whitfield entering with casual confidence of someone who controlled the situation completely. His smile had vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator who'd caught his prey. "Reverend Goodwin," he said mockingly. "Or perhaps I should say Nathan Birdsong, son of the war chief who caused me so much trouble 20 years ago. Yes, I remember you, older now, but still carrying that same self-righteous anger that got your parents killed." Nathan's carefully maintained character dissolved, revealing the warrior beneath the preacher's disguise. "Marcus Whitfield, I've been hunting you for a long time." "And I've been aware of your hunt for most of it," Whitfield replied. "Did you really think you could walk into my stronghold and observe my operations without consequences? I began suspecting you the moment you asked about patrol schedules. No simple preacher needs such detailed knowledge of military movements." His attention turned to Rebecca, studying her with disturbing intensity. "As for your wife, I suspect she's not who she claims to be either. Something familiar about those eyes, that bone structure. I wonder if you might be the missing witness from the Caldwell wagon train, the one survivor whose body we never found." Rebecca met his gaze steadily, drawing on the strength she'd found in the sacred cave, the wisdom of ancient teachers who had faced their own enemies with courage. "My name is Rebecca Hartwell, and I saw you murder my friends." Whitfield's smile returned, cold and triumphant. "Perfect. The hunter and the witness, delivered together. You'll both live long enough to tell me who else knows about my operations, what evidence you've gathered, and how best to use your deaths to further my plans." "Use our deaths?" Nathan asked, though Rebecca suspected he already understood. "Oh yes, 2 more tragic victims of savage Indian brutality. Your bodies will be found scalped and mutilated, clear evidence that we need stronger military action against rebellious tribes. Your deaths will justify the very operations you sought to prevent." Whitfield gestured to his men, who moved forward with practiced efficiency. Take them to the storage building. Make sure they're secure but unharmed for now. We'll begin questioning them tomorrow when I've had time to consider which of their agonies will prove most persuasive. As they were marched across the compound under heavy guard, Rebecca caught Nathan's eye and saw not despair, but determination. They had the evidence needed to destroy Whitfield's network, hidden in places their captors hadn't yet searched. Their mission wasn't over. It had simply entered its most dangerous phase. The storage building where they were confined had once housed mining equipment, its thick walls and heavy door designed to protect valuable machinery from theft. Now it served as a prison for those who threatened Whitfield's operations. And Rebecca noticed as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, they weren't the only occupants. In the far corner of the building, barely visible in the shadows cast by moonlight through a small window, huddled a figure that made Rebecca's blood run cold with recognition. An elderly Shawnee man, clearly wounded, wearing the distinctive clothing and ceremonial markings of a tribal elder. His presence here meant Whitfield's network was expanding beyond simply manufacturing conflicts. They were now taking hostages from tribal leadership, probably for information about defensive preparations or internal tribal politics. The old man looked up as they entered, his eyes meeting Nathan's in moment of recognition that transcended cultural boundaries. Here were people who understood each other's situation, allied by common enemy if not shared culture. Nathan spoke, softly in Shawnee, identifying himself and asking about the elder's condition. The response, though Rebecca couldn't understand the words, conveyed a sense of urgency that needed no translation. This man possessed information Whitfield desperately wanted, information that could determine the fate of entire tribal communities, if obtained through torture or coercion. He says his name is Walking Bear, Nathan whispered to Rebecca. He's a peace chief who came here under flag of truce to negotiate about missing tribal members. Whitfield's people captured him 3 days ago. Rebecca felt anger rising. Not the helpless rage of a victim, but the focused fury of someone who had found purpose beyond personal survival. The sacred cave had taught her that individual healing served larger community healing, that personal strength should be used to protect others unable to protect themselves. We have to get him out of here, she said quietly. All of us, tonight before Whitfield begins his interrogations. Nathan nodded, already assessing their prison for weaknesses. The building was solid, but it had been designed to keep people out, not in. The door was barred from outside with heavy timber, but the window, though small, might be enlarged enough for escape if they could work quietly. More importantly, Rebecca realized their captors had made a crucial mistake in confining them together. Whatever Whitfield had planned for tomorrow, he hadn't considered that 3 people working together might achieve what none could accomplish alone. As if responding to her thoughts, Walking Bear spoke again, this time in careful English that surprised both his fellow prisoners. "Young warriors," he said softly, using the title with obvious respect despite their failed mission. "Old Bear has been planning escape for 3 days, was waiting only for dark moon and proper moment. Perhaps spirits have sent help." Rebecca smiled for the first time since their capture, recognizing in the elder's words an echo of the wisdom she'd learned from the sacred cave's ancient teachers. Individual skills combined with collective purpose, knowledge shared across cultural boundaries, survival through cooperation rather than solitary struggle. "Tell us your plan," Nathan whispered, "and we'll tell you ours. Together we might succeed where any of us would fail alone." Walking Bear's plan proved as sophisticated as any military operation. He'd observed guard rotations, identified weaknesses in the settlement's perimeter defenses, even cached supplies for escape along routes he'd scouted during his 3 days of captivity. What he'd lacked was the strength and agility to execute the plan alone, problems that Nathan and Rebecca could help solve. Rebecca's contribution proved equally valuable. Her medical knowledge included understanding of plants that could be found even in early spring, including some that could induce temporary unconsciousness in guards who consumed them. More importantly, her 4 months in the sacred cave had taught her to move with minimal sound, to find paths through terrain that seemed impassable, to read signs that indicated safety or danger. Nathan brought tactical knowledge and physical capability, plus intimate understanding of Whitfield's methods and psychology. He knew how the man thought, what mistakes he might make, how to use his arrogance against him. Together, the 3 prisoners represented something Whitfield hadn't anticipated, a combination of cultural knowledge, tactical skill, and determined purpose that transformed them from victims into genuine threats to his operation. As they refined their escape plan, Rebecca felt a profound sense of connection to both her fellow prisoners and the ancient wisdom that had prepared her for this moment. The sacred cave had taught her that survival required more than individual endurance. It demanded community, cooperation, the willingness to risk personal safety for larger good. Walking Bear's presence reminded her that the wisdom she'd absorbed from the cave's painted walls wasn't abstract history, but living tradition. Knowledge that connected past and present, individual and community, survival and purpose. Nathan represented the bridge between worlds she was learning to navigate, the possibility of justice that transcended personal vengeance. Together, they spent the night preparing for escape that would either free them to complete their mission or end their lives in the attempt. Rebecca documented their plan in the same code she'd used earlier, hiding the information in places Whitfield's men wouldn't think to search. If they died attempting to escape, perhaps someone else would find the evidence and continue their work. But as dawn approached, Rebecca felt certainty rather than fear. The sacred cave had prepared her for this moment, taught her that individual transformation served larger purposes, that knowledge gained through suffering should be used to prevent others' pain. The woman who had fled the wagon train massacre in terror had become someone who could face its architect with courage. The months of hiding and learning had created not just a survivor, but a warrior in the truest sense, someone who fought not for personal glory, but for justice, not for revenge, but for truth, not for individual victory, but for community healing. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small window of their prison, Rebecca Hartwell, Nathan Birdsong, and Walking Bear prepared to attempt an escape that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of countless innocent people caught in Whitfield's web of manufactured hatred and calculated violence. The sacred cave had taught Rebecca that every ending created new beginnings, that every individual choice rippled outward to affect entire communities. What ended here in Whitfield's compound would begin something new. Either their deaths would inspire others to take up their cause, or their escape would provide the evidence needed to destroy a network of exploitation that had claimed too many lives already. Either way, Rebecca faced the coming day with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose and was prepared to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited. The ancient teachers of the sacred cave had prepared her well for this moment when personal healing transformed into collective action, when individual courage served community justice, when the wisdom of the past empowered the hope of the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.